Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Ireland and to be on this wonderful campus at Limerick. And I just really want to thank very warmly Deirdre Hogan and the organising committee for inviting me to join you on this important dialogue day, and a network which I think I've already seen in my short introduction to it has the potential, I think, to really support your work in many, many ways across the country. So I'm very, very happy to be here with you. My title this morning, I should also say I'm very lucky to have found my way here this morning. I ought to thank a lady called Patricia Collins, who more or less walked me all the way to this meeting today. So I got a bit lost on campus, so I've explored a bit more than I intended. My title this morning is Teaching for Diversity, Inclusivity and Social Justice, a Cosmopolitan Journey. And I'm not actually going to use the words development education I haven't planned to use the words development education, but I hope that from what Deirdre has said, from what Patrick has said, that you will be able to make the links between the language that I'm using this morning and the language that they have also used. I'm going to draw on material from research that I've done alone on students' perspectives on schooling and very much on child rights. But I'm also going to draw on work that I've done with my colleague Hugh Starkey, notably a book we published together in 2010 called Teachers and Human Rights Education, and equally a book we published in 2005 called Changing Citizenship. So some of the theoretical ideas, some of the backgrounds of the things I will say today are work that I've developed with a colleague, and I wish to acknowledge him there. And I wish also to try and make the links between diversity and democracy. And if there's only one thing you remember from my talk this morning, I would argue that we cannot really have a strong democracy unless we have diversity. If we all think the same, what's the point of democracy? Why don't we just have some benign ruler taking care of us? And so I will argue that diversity is absolutely fundamental to democracy, and it's not something that we should be frightened of. It's not something which is exceptional. It's something which has always been there in society, I will argue, even in societies like that in Ireland, where the history and the stories and so on suggest a homogeneous past. So that's what I want to suggest. And then I thought I'd begin with a love story. I don't know, well, I've never told any stories in Ireland before, but I guess that you're as romantic as anywhere else in the world. So I wanted to start with a short story from 1949. And 1949, 1 year after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was pronounced, this couple got married. And you'll remember from the Universal Declaration that the right to marry and the right to select one's partner were established very, very clearly in international law. But 1 year later, this couple, who married actually in the UK, some 25 miles from London, in 1949, had great obstacles before they actually arrived on their wedding day. Their names are Maurice and Esme lived in Singapore. She lived through Japanese occupation, and after the Second World War, she was working there as a young woman. She'd had her schooling interrupted, and she met Maurice, and he fell in love. And as soon as his parents found out, he was on his national service. His mother wrote to his commanding officer and had him moved to Iraq. This was clearly a very ethnocentric and racist impulse on the part of his mother. She just did that. As soon as he reached the age of 21, because that was the age of majority in those days, he got himself transferred back to Singapore, and his mother realised that unless Esme was invited to England and they got married there, that she was probably going to lose her son. Now, in those days, many people said about interracial marriages, what they used to call mixed marriages, that they were bad for the children. Some of you who are older in this room may even remember those kinds of discussions that happened in the 1950s, 1960s, that such marriages were not good for the children. There's not the right kind of place to bring up children. Now, I've heard that argument very recently in the context of debates around the globe, in the UK, and perhaps they've been going on here too, in terms of same-sex marriage, in relation to they're not very good places to bring up children. So the same kinds of arguments are repeated for those we regard as different, other. So I just wanted to share that. They got married, this couple, this is a picture of them with their children, and this is, for the moment, happy ending to a story. I began with a story, and I want to move on now to move from a story to the notion of democracy. I've talked about democracy and diversity, but I want to explore the fragility of democracy in our society today. The Council of Europe published a report in 2011 called Living Together, Combining Diversity and Freedom in 21st Century Europe. And it based its findings on the principles of the European Convention on Human Rights, to which our countries are all signed up, especially individual freedom and equality before the law. And this report found that discrimination and intolerance are widespread in Europe today, particularly against Roma and against immigrants, as well as people of recent migrant background who are often treated as foreigners, even in countries where they are both natives and citizens. So this is the context in which we find ourselves working. And the Council of Europe is a conservative type of organisation. It's an intergovernmental organisation, so it doesn't normally criticise the countries and the governments that make up its membership. And this report talked about 8 risks to our democratic values. And I'm going to focus on some of them, but they include rising intolerance, rising support for xenophobic and populist parties, discrimination, the presence of a population virtually without rights, parallel societies, Islamic extremism, loss of democratic freedoms, and a potential tension between religious freedom and freedom of expression. And we can find those kinds of debates taking place, those kinds of issues. We can find examples, I think, in the news every day here in Europe. And the report spoke particularly about hostile and discriminatory treatment towards minorities, including national and religious minorities, including LGBT and Roma. So there's hostility towards immigrants, which we could class as visible minorities, asylum seekers, expressions of anti-Muslim hostility, anti-Semitism. These are things which are lurking in our European societies today. And the notion is that the report also talks about who we are as Europeans. And it says identities are a voluntary matter for the individual concerned, and no one should be forced to choose or accept one primary identity to the exclusion of others. European societies need to embrace diversity and accept that one can be a hyphenated European, for instance, a Turkish German. But this can work only if all long-term residents are accepted as citizens, and if all, whatever their faith, culture or ethnicity, are treated equally by the law, the authorities and their fellow citizens. So this is, if you like, a normative statement from an intergovernmental body saying identities are not something which you tell me who I am or I tell you who you are. Identities are something which are flexible, movable, and we need to allow for we shouldn't start labelling people. That's the way perhaps it's most simply expressed. I also would like just to draw your attention to another international document. This is the White Paper on Intercultural Dialogue, and its subheading is Living Together as Equals in Dignity. And this statement from the Council of Europe Ministers of Foreign Affairs said, our common future depends on our ability to safeguard and develop human rights as enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights, Democracy and the Rule of Law, and to promote mutual understanding. The intercultural approach offers a forward-looking model for managing cultural diversity. It proposes a conception based on individual human dignity. So whatever kind of labels we're giving to our education, we're talking about the conception of learning based on individual human dignity. And yet, just to remind you, there are opposite kinds of forces around us in Europe, and there's an example of a radical right-wing populism from Switzerland at the bottom. You can see, and in a recent election campaign, there's a Swiss flag, and all the white sheep are kicking out the black sheep out of their country. That was used as an election campaign by the far right in Switzerland. And then you have another poster there from the UK, from UKIP, United Kingdom Independence Party. 5,000 new people settle here every week, say no to mass immigration. And I like this slide and this picture because somebody has written, say no to mass hysteria. So we are facing many challenges, political challenges, and I think what we need to remember as educators is that there is a political context in which we're working, and we cannot afford, I would argue, to do nothing. There is a political context which can... Democracy is not assured, it's not a given, it's something which we have to be prepared to defend. So we're concerned about student teachers coming out and being ready to act, and as Deirdre said, prepared to take action. But we have to also think, I think, as teacher educators, what is our political stand going to be, as well as what is our educational stand going to be. So, in many places in Europe, and including in the UK, and also in Norway, where I'm working for a good part of my time, there is a concern that greater diversity might be undermining our democratic practices. So I just want to... I've argued that democracy and diversity are interlinked, but I just want to explore the other side to that issue. Schools, what are they? Well, from the point of view of kids, I think schools are very much social spaces, and these are young children messing about and being a bit naughty, actually. But they're very much about living together, getting along, social spaces. Children aren't usually coming to school and thinking, well, I hope I come home today with learning more maths. They're thinking, I hope I go to school today and meet my friends and have a good time. So schools are social places for young people. But they're also places of conflict and violence. And here we have two examples of children excluding others. And it's just important, I think, to remind ourselves about how school can feel from the point of view of learners. They can be great places. They can also be conflict-ridden and violent and scary places. And I've also wanted to think about a different part of the world and take you across to Kurdistan, Iraq, because here I want to think about new states in Western Europe, in places like Ireland, the UK, Norway. We assume democracy. We're proud of our traditions, of our institutions, and so on. And we're often a little bit, I would suggest, a little bit complacent about human rights, about democracy. Here in Kurdistan, Iraq, it's interesting to me the classrooms are crowded. This picture here is not set up for the camera as an exception. Children are squashed into quite difficult conditions. The previous conflict has damaged the educational infrastructure, but the government has introduced a new curriculum, and they have introduced a subject called human rights education, where the emphasis is on international solidarity, cooperation, and so on. And I think that's partly in recognition that the Kurdish struggle has also been a human rights struggle, and that in order for the Kurds to fight for their ideal of a homeland of their own, that they are looking to the rest of us for support. So they are looking in terms of solidarity. But also there's a strong nationalist rhetoric there, where they're talking about a strong Kurdish homeland, us as Kurds, we should be proud. And that presents also some challenges, because if that goes to one direction, it could be exclusionary. Kurdistan is a very, very diverse, politically diverse, religiously diverse society. So there are tensions both in Western Europe and in new democracies, in post-conflict societies, about balancing or dealing with cosmopolitan ideas and also nationalist ideas. And this is just a picture from one of my students. She was doing research. She's a Ukrainian girl, and she was doing research in November 2011 in Kiev, and she got students to tell their view of school. And you've got, in this picture, her concept, of a child's concept of power relations, and the tree represents the teacher, and the bushes and the flowers represent the children. And the little caption there in Ukrainian is saying, we're worried about what kind of marks we're going to get. So we remember there are power relations in school too. And there's another one where the teacher is a wise owl, and the children are all rabbits and other little creatures. And I did say to her, don't owls eat rabbits? And she said, no, Audrey, you've misunderstood. But this is clearly also about power relations at school and teacher and child. And I want to introduce another word into my discourse, which is the concept of superdiversity. And this is a concept coined by Steve Vertovec to present the modern condition of global migration. We're not just living in a diverse age. There's always been migration, there's always been diversity, but Steve Vertovec is suggesting that we're living in an age of super diversity, and that poses other kinds of challenges in terms of how fast we are to respond to change and so on. So when I hear the word diversity talked about in Britain, I often hear people talk about managing diversity, and diversity is seen as a problem to be solved. I don't know whether you have that kind of discourse here or not, but I would argue very much that we need to stop seeing diversity as a problem to be solved and to see it as an asset to our societies, that we actually are bringing something rich into our societies. And in this book, shown here, which I have to admit I've never read, but I just like the title, A Manager's Guide to Solving Problems and Turning Diversity into a Competitive Advantage from the business point of view. But it's not just a business asset, it's also a democratic asset. And I would suggest that minorities do not represent a democratic deficit unless we think of ourselves and our way as superior. In Norway, for example, we have a lot of migrants who've come as asylum seekers and refugees. And often the Norwegian majority, there tends to be a discourse of we're very democratic and they need to learn, they need to catch up. But actually, often these people have experienced real struggles for justice. They really know what fighting for democracy is. They've come because they're trade unionists. They've come because of other terrible conditions. They really are far more committed to democracy than the majority might assume. And another challenge, I think, to our society is to ask ourselves the question, when we talk about integration, do we think of it as a one-way process? So does the curriculum we're developing seek to make them more like us? Do we talk, or is there a rhetoric, both an official rhetoric or our conversations over a cup of coffee about seeing their lack of skills as the main barrier to success? And do we actually talk about, are we able to acknowledge or do we deny structural racism in our society? I remember the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Tony Blair, holding a meeting in Downing Street a few months before the end of his period of office. And he said, I'm very proud that there's no more racism in Britain, and that people don't insult each other in the street, and that we're all nice to each other. Fine. I think the public discourse had moved on from the gross racism of the era of his childhood, or even may have changed during his period of office. But to deny the structural exclusions that were going on was he was pulling a mask over his head, I would suggest. And I want to think a little bit about the notion of cosmopolitanism, and just to reflect on that word, because I think that word is a key word in helping us to make the links between diversity, tolerance, inclusivity in the local community and in the global context. Cassel's talks about cosmopolitanism and negotiating multiple identities and loyalties. And he says, the principle of each individual being a citizen of one nation-state no longer corresponds with reality for millions of people who move across borders and who belong in various ways in multiple places. Now, that's probably always been a long, long time been true of people living in Ireland and the United Kingdom. Many of them choose to carry two passports. But in many places in the world, you cannot have dual citizenship. But I suppose I can identify with this because I'm living in one country, working in another, and working across the globe. And it's not just the reality of privileged groups of people, but also the relatively disadvantaged in many societies. And I think, how do we teach the citizenship? I think there is a model of a rather outmoded nationalist citizenship which exists, where the nation-state is seeing the possession of a dominant national group. The state privileges the identity, the language, the history, culture, literature, myths and religion of the dominant group. The state is the expression of the nationhood of that dominant group, and anyone who doesn't belong to this group either needs to assimilate or is excluded. That's an idea written about by Will Kimlicka, Canadian philosopher of education, in his book Multicultural States and Intercultural Citizens. And the nation-state is therefore constructed on a national language, national history, national heroes, national symbols, national literature, a national education system, a national media, a national military, and in some cases, a national religion. But John Dewey, writing in the early 20th century, reminds us that nationalism is something relatively new in the history of the world. In Europe, he reminds us also in relation to education that the movement for state education was associated with nationalist movements. Broad mass education developed from the 1870s onwards, when nationalism was at its peak. And so education became a civic function identified with building the nation state, where previously it had been something done by voluntary groups, by churches, by and so on for elites. And cosmopolitanism gave way to nationalism, and loyalty to the state was emphasized rather than loyalty to humanity. So we could also think about development education as something which is about loyalty to humanity. And the churches and these other people who are promoting education during the 19th century were often stressing loyalty to humanity. That's not to say they didn't sometimes encourage superiority and so on, but they actually saw loyalty to the international, not to the international, to the global community rather than loyalty to the state. So the education of the citizen of the state rather than the cultured individual became an aim of education during the period of mass education. So this is something quite new, I would argue. If we think about cosmopolitanism, of course it comes from Kant, it comes from a global vision embracing all human societies. It's based on dignity, the inherent rights of individuals as members of a universal humanity, and the notion that we should act towards others as an end, not as a means. Or as Mary Calder expresses it, the cosmopolitan ideal combines a commitment to humanist principles and norms, an assumption of human equality with the recognition of difference and indeed a celebration of diversity. So we could read there a commitment to human rights principles. And Matsura of UNESCO 2002 says each individual must acknowledge not only otherness in all its forms, but also the plurality of his or her own identity within societies that are themselves plural. So we need to start about thinking about ourselves and our multiple identities. And Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher, says, cosmopolitanism doesn't contradict patriotism. He's saying, I'm saying that we have no choice but to be cosmopolitans and patriots, which means to fight for the kind of patriotism that is open to universal solidarities against other, more closed kinds. So how does this relate to culture and diversity? I'm a great admirer of Stuart Hall, who I would say was probably the leading intellectual of British society in the 20th century. And Stuart Hall says cultural identity is a matter of becoming as well as of being. It belongs to the future as much as the past. It is not something which already exists, transcending place, time, history and culture. Cultural identities are subject to the continuous play of history, culture and power. Identities are the names we give to the different ways we are positioned by and position ourselves within the narratives of the past, within the stories of the past. So cultural identities are not fixed, they're constantly being shaped and reshaped and responding to the context. And some examples of children talking about this from Leicester. Najma says, I'm Asian and my religion is Islam. I live in a multicultural area with Christians, Sikhs, Muslims and Hindus. And Ravinda says, I'm proud of my religion and I don't care if my colour is different because we're all equal. And I think in that Ravinda statement we can see a young man who's encountered hostility or prejudice or racism. How do we approach culture teaching? I think in Britain, we've often talked about saris, samosas and steel bands. It's very much essentialised culture. Or the 4 Fs, food, fashion, festivals and folklore. This is a very easy way, but not a very sophisticated way, I would suggest, of teaching about culture. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we develop a more nuanced approach to culture? Whose values are we promoting? And does anything go? Do we just teach anything when we teach culture? Or do we need to actually think about this being a little bit more complicated in relation to the ideas about cultural identity? And I think Peter Figueroa suggests that what we need to do is to think about cultural relativism and relationalism. And he's arguing against cultural relativism. He's saying it's not that anything should go. It's not that we should just say human rights out the window, that's your culture, you can do what you like. regardless of any agreed principles. But he's saying a cultural relativist approach demands that cultures be judged by their own standards, not by any exterior standards. But something a bit more nuanced is a relationist approach is based on an intercultural dialogue, and dialogue is the theme of today, between groups, and aims to work out accommodations that respect the dignity and equal rights of all parties. So how are we going to deal with accommodations in our complex and diverse societies? So to look at bringing these ideas together, education for cosmopolitan citizenship then, this is an idea where we've tried to develop in our book, Changing Citizenship. And we say citizenship is based on feeling, on status, and practice. So it's not based on, these are three elements of citizenship. Citizenship is a feeling, it's a status, and it's a practice. So a feeling of belonging, the rights and responsibilities, the degree you feel you fit into and belong to a neighbourhood, a school, a church, a mosque, synagogue, a temple, the degree to which you feel you belong within a nation, and the degree to which you belong in the human family. That's part of citizenship in a broad sense. The status of a citizen can be the legal status, one's nationality, passport, the right to enter and leave, but it can also be a moral status. We're members of the human family entitled to human rights. So if we take that status, the first one is exclusive. You either got the right passport or you haven't. The other one, the moral status, a member of the human family entitled to human rights, is an inclusive status. But citizenship is also a practice. You can be working in a local community for a better society, joining clubs, sports clubs, music, art, culture, and so on. It can be campaigning, it can be fighting for justice, for fair wages, for women's equality, for equal rights for minorities. It can be in a community, being a school governor, working in a housing association, and so on. Or it can be religious-based activities. All these can be part of how we practice our citizenship. And James Banks says that a citizen's racial, cultural, language, and religious characteristics often significantly influence whether she is viewed as a citizen within her society. So you can be a citizen, but not actually be viewed as a citizen. So my question is, how can citizenship then, education address, based on national identity, really address this? And is global citizenship then the answer? And I think we have to look to a citizenship based on human rights principles, citizenship education based on human rights principles. And I would look to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child as two guiding documents there. And just briefly to remind you that the Universal Declaration talks about dignity, equal and inalienable rights. It talks about members of the human family. It's that metaphor of a family. It also, all members of the family have dignity, equal rights, and their rights can't be taken away. The notion of the Universal Declaration is explicit there in the preamble to create justice and peace in the world. And René Cassin, who was one of the writers of the Universal Declaration, said rights are only meaningful when people know about them and understand them. It's the culture of a society more than the law that creates the conditions for social peace. And so, basically, not only is education a right, but in international law, education, human rights education is also a right. We have a right to an education in human rights. And a right is not a right unless you know about it, and a right is not a right unless you're prepared to struggle for it. So basically, human rights are something which we need to teach, and children need to know about, but they also need to know how they can defend and fight for and engage with human rights. So what's the role of a school then? In our global age, not all the kids we teach are going to be citizens of the nation state in which they're studying. And James Banks and others reviewed features of citizenship education appropriate to multicultural societies. and concluded that the teaching of human rights should underpin citizenship education courses and programs in multicultural nation states. It's not enough just to teach about the Constitution, which may not cover everybody. It's not enough to teach just about the laws of the country. These may be important to know, of course, but they're not sufficient. We need to also talk about something which is inclusive of all. And I think this principle should apply whether or not the ethnic or cultural composition of the population is apparently diverse. And its recognition that all human beings are holders of human rights is the underpinning principle for education for cosmopolitan citizenship. And this is expressed nicely in this book, which is taken from Hong Kong. It's a bilingual book, and it's taken to illustrate the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it's talking about Article 13, I think. Every child should be able to speak openly about their thoughts and ideas, it says on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, with the child with a zip across its mouth, but some children are not allowed to speak their minds. An example of a rights-based school in London, everybody fits in here, posters, an atmosphere, a context, for a school. And this is a picture in Busan, in Korea. This is the head teacher and one of her friends showing us, one of her colleagues showing us how they have posters talking about disability and inclusion in the school. And up the steps they have the various articles of the convention. It feels a little bit moralistic to me in this particular school, but that's the way that they were trying to deal with this. In Cape Town, South Africa, a clear statement of principles. This is a gun and drug abuse-free school, so an explicit commitment to principles. And this is a picture also from South Africa showing Nelson Mandela as a young man boxing, and a campaign, Know Your Rights, Use Your Rights. And it talks about prisoners, refugees, people with disabilities, and so on. And this is a very interesting one. This is children outside a human rights education conference in Korea. So we went to Korea in 2007. We were invited by the National Commission for Human Rights and the Ministry of Education. And when we got to this conference, we were travelling around the country, they said, oh, we should warn you. In this town, people are very outspoken, and you might find people protesting against the British government and against the war in Iraq. And we said, that's fine. We're not here to defend the British government. We don't necessarily agree with the British government. But when we got there were children protesting not against the British government, but about human rights. And they said, it's all very well having a human rights education curriculum, but what we want you to know is, in Korea, Korean teenagers are living in exam hell. You must know the truth that Korean education is teenagers killing education. And this was the movement for teenagers' human rights. They were saying, all very well having a curriculum, but you've got to actually have an atmosphere and a structure of schooling which is inclusive. So that was a very powerful message. And these young people were invited into the conference, and they were part of the dialogue for the day. And then it's about accommodations. Here we have pictures of school children in London with the various aspects of their religious identities incorporated into uniform. And we have the rather, I've always felt, unflattering hijab of the Metropolitan Police. It's not a very handsome uniform. So then, if we go back to the future and to the beginning of my talk, I think we need more humanity and we need more openness. And we go back to Esme and Morris and their family and growing up with diversity. And I think we need to see this as an advantage in life. I really do. And you may have guessed by now that these pictures are not pictures that are entirely unrelated to my own life. The little girl looking very solemn, grabbing a teddy bear in the front is actually me. And I see growing up with diversity as has been an advantage in life. And so I think diversity is something we genuinely need to embrace. we need to be able to tell stories, because by telling stories and by engaging with real human engagement and listening to the stories our children tell, encouraging our children to tell new stories, both individual and collective, and new collective stories, not just these old national stories which were exclusive, but also these inclusive new stories. I think we are capable of building on diversity and creating a stronger and more democratic future. So thank you very much for listening. Diversity has always been the norm for me. I think it's always been the norm in our societies, and what we're doing now is recognising this. Thank you very much.